our hypothalamus. What do we want to start with? Well, we could start with, let's start with our posterior pituitary. So the two hormones that are coming from the posterior pituitary are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So let's start with oxytocin. Oxytocin its job is to stimulate smooth muscle contraction, reproductive smooth muscle specifically. So oxytocin stimulates reproductive smooth muscle. Its release is going to be stimulated by orgasm, or it's stimulated by neural stimulus due to like a baby pushing on the cervix. So we could say nervous stimuli from cervix. It's also stimulated by nervous stimulation coming from suckling. So we would say nervous stimuli from suckling. So oxytocin is definitely under neural control. So those are all nervous stimulation of some sort. And it will be released to the system and stimulate reproductive smooth muscle. So what's reproductive smooth muscle? The uterus. There's a layer called the myometrium, which is going to be the main target. But it's also released at orgasm, so it can stimulate reproductive smooth muscle in the penis as well. And then also in the mammary glands, it stimulates milk letdown. So stimulates milk letdown. In the mammary glands. So hopefully what you notice about the posterior pituitary hormones is that they have pretty quick effects. Our anterior pituitary hormones have longer effects, but these are going to have pretty quick effects. And they're neurohormones because they're being released from neurons into the blood. So as far as chemical classification goes, they're peptides. And as far as classification by method of release, they're neurohormones. I'll go over antidiuretic hormone, and then we'll take a break before we do the anterior pituitary hormones, because I have to do some diuresis. It happens a lot when you're pregnant. Okay, is everybody good on this? So our other posterior pituitary hormone is the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. There, the right half of the board really stinks. So the stimulus, the direct stimulus for ADH release, angiotensin II. That is 2. So angiotensin II is a hormone that's released in response to a drop in blood pressure. So for angiotensin II release, you can't really call that humoral because it's a drop in blood pressure that does it. But for antidiuretic hormone, you could say ADH release is under hormonal control, and when ADH is released to the system, it's going to stimulate the kidneys to increase their aquaporins. And what our aquaporins do, they're water channels that are going to allow water to be uptaken. So aquaporins will increase water reabsorption. And we call it reabsorption in the kidney because we already absorbed it once in our small intestine through the digestive system. It gets filtered out in the urine, and if we need to pull it back, we're reabsorbing it. So in the kidneys, we'll stimulate water reabsorption. That water reabsorption is going to increase our blood volume, which helps to increase blood pressure. And again, antidiuretic hormone is a peptide, and since it's being released from a neuron to the blood, it's a neurohormone.
So the type of stimulus is nervous or hormonal, or both?
Hormonal for ADH.
Because the okay.
Let's look at our anterior pituitary and the hormone that's releasing. So, I don't know, we'll just pick a system. We'll do the HPT axis. So, which is the hypothalamo-pituitary thyroid axis. So that starts with TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. That will be released into the primary plexus, travels through the portal veins, enters the secondary plexus. It'll bind to TRH receptors on our thyrotropes. Our thyrotropes will release TSH, which is going to stimulate our follicular cells of the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. So, what do you think is going to stimulate TRH release? What brings us back to homeostasis? Negative feedback. So if we need to stimulate TRH release, then what would it be? It would be low levels of thyroid hormone. So if you've got a drop in thyroid hormone, that's what's being released in the system. So if you're low in thyroid hormone, that will stimulate TRH release. So what type of stimulus is that? Humoral. This is in the blood. So thyroid hormones aren't stimulating TRH release. It's the low levels of thyroid hormones that are. So we would say this is humoral. Now TRH stimulating TSH release, what type of stimulus is that? Hormonal. Because now it's a hormone stimulating hormone release. All right, TSH stimulating thyroid hormone release. What's that? Hormonal. Because we've got the tropic hormone stimulating thyroid hormone release. As far as our classification of these different hormones go, TRH, by chemical classification, it fits in the peptide protein category, which means that it's water soluble. It's being released from neurons into blood. So what is it by method of release?
A hormone.
It's a neurohormone. These are neurons that are releasing it to the blood, so it's a neurohormone. Now, TSH is also a peptide protein. I'll give you a hint. Most of our hormones are peptides or proteins. We only have a few steroids. So what is it by method of release? Is the anterior pituitary nervous tissue or glandular tissue?
Glandular.
It's glandular, so it's just a regular hormone by method of release. Thyroid hormone. By chemical classification, if we just look at chemical classification, it's actually a biogenic amine. It's coming from glandular tissue, so it's also a hormone. It's the exception to the rule about biogenic amines. Most biogenic amines are hydrophilic. Thyroid hormone is not. It's lipophilic. So it's a biogenic amine, but it behaves like a steroid. This is the only biogenic amine that behaves like a steroid, is thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormones, again, are going to target most cells in the body and increase the metabolism. Any questions on the HPT axis? Okay, next let's do our gonadotropes. So, cells we're looking at are gonadotropes. The releasing hormone that affects them is GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. And it will be released into the primary plexus, travel through the portal vein, pull in the secondary plexus, bind to GnRH receptors on our gonadotropes, which will release two hormones, LH and FSH. LH is going to be the hormone that stimulates our steroid hormone production. So it will stimulate the production of testosterone, estrogen, or progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone are under weird regulation, so I'm not going to make you worry about the details of that. Testosterone is a normal negative feedback loop. FSH is going to stimulate cells to help develop our gametes. So we'll say cells to help. It's not stimulating the gametes directly, it's stimulating cells that are helping the gametes grow. So it's stimulating cells to help gamete formation. The gametes are sperm and oocytes. So as far as GnRH release goes, it's complex in females, so we won't worry about the stimulus for that release until the end of the semester. Right now, though, testosterone is a straightforward negative feedback loop. So if we're just talking about testosterone, then what do you think would stimulate GnRH release? Low testosterone levels. So if you've got a drop in testosterone, that will stimulate GnRH release. So what type of stimulus is that? Humoral, yep. GnRH is a peptide or protein. What is it by method of release? It's a neurohormone because it's being released from a neuron into the blood. Into the blood that's in that hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. It stimulates our gonadotropes to release FSH and LH. So FSH and LH are what type of release? Hormonal. They're hormonal by method of, or it's hormonal stimulation for their type of release. As far as type of hormones go, they are regular hormones. And as far as their chemical class goes, they're also in the peptide protein category. Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone are steroids. So these are all steroid hormones, which means they're lipid soluble. So they're steroids by chemical classification. What are they by method of release? Hormones. They're just regular hormones because they're coming from the glandular tissue in the gonads. Any questions on this? This is called the HPG axis. I forgot to mention that. So it's the hypothalamo-pituitary gonad axis. And in males, it's a straightforward negative feedback loop. In females, it's very complicated. So we'll talk about that at the end of the semester. Any questions on the HPG axis? As far as if you need to think about effects of these steroid hormones, estrogen you could say is causing thickening of the uterine lining. Progesterone is also causing thickening of the uterine lining, but it's also stimulating blood vessel development and uterine gland development. Testosterone stimulates also all the things that we associate with being male. Increased muscle protein, increased facial hair, deepening of the voice, aggression, libido. So that's what testosterone does. We good on this? Okay, next let's do our HPA axis. So our HPA axis is the hypothalamo-hypophyseal adrenal axis. I have this thing right here. And it's going to start up here with CRH release. CRH is going to be dumped into the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system and stimulate cells called corticotropes. It binds the CRH receptor, and they release ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH targets the zona fasciculata of the adrenal glands and causes them to release cortisol. So the stimulus for CRH release is a little more complicated. It's not a straightforward negative feedback loop. CRH release is caused by time of day. So we've got an increase in cortisol right as you're waking up. You get another one right after lunch. So those are just normal times to release extra cortisol. But other stimulus, like an artificial stimulus, I guess it's not an artificial stimulus. Stress is a natural response. We just tend to be stressed more often than we need to. So stress, for time of day, don't worry about what type of stimulus that is. Stress is a neural stimulus. So if you're stressed, you increase CRH release. And then when CRH is released, it's going to bind our corticotropes and stimulate ACTH release. As far as CRH goes, it's a peptide or protein. And it's a neurohormone. It's going to stimulate ACTH release, which is also a peptide or protein. This is just a hormone because it's coming from glandular tissue, stimulating our zona fasciculata to release cortisol. Cortisol, by chemical class, is a steroid, and it's also just a regular hormone. And the effects of cortisol are going to be to raise blood glucose. So it does this through stimulating glycogenolysis in the liver, stimulating protein catabolism, stimulating gluconeogenesis then, using those proteins to make new glucose in the liver. Now, any questions on the HPA axis?
So the regulation for both ACTH and for cortisol is hormonal.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so ACTH is under hormonal regulation by CRH. Cortisol is under hormonal regulation by ACTH. CRH is under neural stimulation because of stress. I don't know what to call time of day. This is probably neural. Let's see, we've done ACTH, FSH, LH, TSH, so we have prolactin and growth hormone left. So next, let's do growth hormone. Growth hormone is released from somatotropes. And somatotropes are under dual inhibition and stimulation. So they're the only tropic hormones, or the only cells that are responding to both. So they've got somatostatin receptors. Somatostatin is the growth hormone release inhibiting hormone. Man, that side of the board really stinks. And then we've got growth hormone releasing hormone. So those are going to be the two releasing hormones and release inhibiting hormones that are involved. Both of those are peptides or proteins. And they're both neurohormones. As far as the stimulus for release goes, growth hormone releasing hormone is going to be, both of them are affected by time of day and age. So growth hormone is, the stimulus for the release of these is a lot more complicated than our other hormones. Age is an effect, like the nutrient levels is an effect, other things that are affecting it, time of day, particularly for somatostatin. So those are going to affect their release. Somatostatin specifically is inhibited by melatonin. So at night, when children are sleeping and melatonin levels go up, melatonin inhibits somatostatin release, so that growth hormone releasing hormone can have a big effect, and lots of growth hormone will be released. So let's say it's night, we've got no somatostatin present, then we'll release growth hormone. Growth hormone targets most cells in the body, and the effect is to increase growth, which is in general what we call anabolism, or building up. If we wanted to talk about specific targets, we could say at muscle, it is going to stimulate anabolism. At the liver, not the liver, at adipose, it stimulates lipolysis, which is great. It's a great effect of growth hormone, so that it breaks down our fat. So growth hormone is what dieters are trying to mimic. They're trying to build up muscle and break down fat. So it's kind of like where everybody wishes they could be. As far as growth hormone goes, it's also in the peptide protein category. And it's a regular hormone. And it's under hormonal stimulation. Because we've got growth hormone releasing hormone that will stimulate its release. So another thing we could say at the liver, it targets the liver to produce other hormones called our IGFs, our insulin-like growth factors, that throughout childhood are going to help grow everything, but then after childhood is when your epiphyseal plates have fused and most of you, all of the rest of you is done growing, then the only target for IGF is going to be your cartilage, so it's why your ears and nose continue to grow. So that would be like the hormonal output, so you could say that IGFs are under hormonal regulation as well. And that's growth hormone. Any questions on that? Anabolism, which is building up. At adipose, it does lipolysis, so breaking down fat. And at the liver, it'll stimulate IGF production. Then our last trophic hormone is prolactin, which is coming from lactotropes. And lactotropes, under normal circumstances, are under inhibition by the prolactin inhibiting hormones, which is dopamine, the neurotransmitter dopamine. So prolactin inhibiting hormone under normal circumstances is bound to dopamine receptors on our lactotropes, and the normal effect is that we don't release prolactin. So that's a normal day-to-day basis. So let's talk about when we do release prolactin. So, still talking about our lactotropes. So how do we inhibit the inhibitor? So at the end of gestation, when we have that positive feedback loop going to deliver the baby, we've got oxytocin being released. So we've got got oxytocin being released into the system. The stimulus for its release in this case would be the baby pushing on the cervix. Man, I wish this side of the board worked better. So I'll just draw it down here. Here's our little baby, and it's pushing on the cervix or suckling. Either of those, both of those, are nervous stimulation that's going to stimulate oxytocin release. So the oxytocin that hits the system in the case of delivery is going to stimulate uterine contraction. That uterine contraction is going to cause that baby to push on the cervix more, resulting in more oxytocin release. We start this positive feedback loop. Oxytocin comes over here and inhibits dopamine release from our prolactin inhibiting hormone, or our dopaminergic neurons there in the hypothalamus. So the oxytocin inhibits that. If we inhibit the inhibitor, then now the lactotropes are free to release prolactin. So prolactin will stimulate the mammary glands to increase milk production. So it's going to stimulate our mammary glands and will increase milk protein production. So after the baby's born, how do we keep this going? How do we keep these inhibited? Well, suckling is going to be the other nervous stimulus that results in oxytocin release. So oxytocin will stimulate the mammary glands for milk letdown. And if you look back in chapter 1, the positive feedback loop that they used as an example is the lactation positive feedback loop. So the baby suckles, that nervous stimulation stimulates oxytocin release, oxytocin stimulates milk letdown, milk ejects from the nipple, the baby suckles. The other thing oxytocin is doing is inhibiting the release of prolactin inhibiting hormone. So as long as the woman is nursing, we'll inhibit the inhibitor and the lactotropes are free to release prolactin, which stimulates milk protein production. So you have to have both prolactin and oxytocin functioning to have normal functioning lactation. All right, any questions on that?
So it's chemical class is what?
Prolactin? Oh, yeah, thank you. So for prolactin, it's also a peptide or protein, and it's a hormone. By method of release, it's just a hormone. For prolactin inhibiting hormone, it's a biogenic amine. Dopamine, you can hear it in its name. But it's water soluble, so it's binding an extracellular receptor and activating second messengers and lactotropes. By method of release, it's a neurohormone. And its release, prolactin inhibiting hormone's release, it just always happens unless it's being inhibited by oxytocin. So that's probably neural. I'm not going to ask you to classify it because it's just always being released unless we have set up this positive feedback loop of oxytocin to inhibit it. So as far